you were looking for the connection between Scott Tracy, Ray Donovan, Dr. Phil, and Gil Grissom, you'd probably be surprised to discover that the link is Armando Nunez, former president and CEO of CBS Global Distribution. Armando talks about his introduction to the international TV business, with his dad selling Thunderbirds, his early years before his move to ViacomCBS, the golden age of US TV series that drove international TV sales for the US studios, with shows like NCIS, CSI, Hawaii Five-0, and the rebooted Star Trek series, and why it's great for everyone to be back in Cannes for Mip TV. Enjoy. Hi, Armando. Welcome to the pod.
Hey, Danny. Good to see you. Thanks for asking me to do this.
Absolute pleasure. I always like to start the podcast with a fun question just to get people thinking. And my question to you is this. If you could be reincarnated as a character in any of the Viacom CBS shows, maybe many of the hundreds that you sold or even before then, which show would you choose?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, but there's a clear-cut answer for me. And my colleagues from CBS would laugh to hear me talk about this, but because they always poked a lot of fun at me over the years. I grew up in New York watching on WPIX those the great reruns of Star Trek. And I grew up as a Trekkie and loved the Star Trek franchise. And I'd probably like to be Jean-Luc Picard. I think in some ways he was much cooler than Captain Kirk. But it was quite amazing because growing up as a Trekkie and then playing a small part in CBS's kind of rebirth of the whole Star Trek franchise, starting with Star Trek Discovery, was just something very cool to be able to take part in, and it was a great project to work on with our colleagues at the studio.
Well, you mentioned some of your colleagues, and I think it was very much a family type of structure that you have with people who work together for a very long period of time. And I guess TV and family for you really went together because you kind of grew up in the world of TV and distribution because your father was in the business. And I suppose that gave you an inspiration to be part of it in a way.
Without question, my dad is the reason that I got into the business in the first place. My mom and dad lived in Cuba. They left Cuba at the time of the revolution. My dad worked for 20th Century Fox in Havana, in film distribution in Havana, which literally meant he would drive the film prints to different theaters around Havana, came to the United States and continued working for Fox and then to ITC Entertainment. And I grew up seeing him always on the international side of the business, but doing this business, which no one had ever heard of back then, or very few people were aware of, and that was the distribution of television content around the world. And as a kid growing up, and my dad bringing home those huge 3/4-inch cassette tapes, and growing up, especially when my dad moved over to ITC Entertainment, and was probably one of the few American kids who were brought up on a bunch of British programming from the ITC catalog, whether it was the Thunderbirds or Joe 90 or Captain Scarlet or Space 1999 or UFO, all these great programs from the ITC library. But I thought my dad had the coolest job in the world. He was a part-time salesperson, part-time diplomat, part-time economist. Back then he'd go off to the airport and, these days you go do a quick trip to Tokyo and you're back and forth in 3 days. And, he'd go out to Asia, and many times his trips were 2 or 3 weeks, and we all go to the airport together and send them off. So, I have very, very fond memories of his travels and what he did back then. And it certainly impacted in terms of what my mindset, in terms of what I wanted to do with my career as I got older.
So you started out in the 1980s at Telepictures, working for Michael Solomon. What was your first?
Michael was my first boss. I'm always very grateful to Michael hiring me in the first place. I sat in the telex room for about a year, sending telexes and stuffing envelopes of marketing materials. If you are a certain age listening to this podcast, you'll have no idea what a telex machine is, but that's the way we communicated around the world way back when. I'm still in touch with Michael. We actually sit on a board of a nonprofit organization, Working Nation, together. And as you know, Michael was one of the pioneers of the international distribution business with Telepictures, which became Lorimar Telepictures, and then eventually sold to Warner Brothers.
And then you joined ABC. What were you doing there? And did that give you a particular exposure to international TV?
All of my jobs gave me that exposure to the power of the medium from a global perspective, because while my particular interest was on the international side, you always had the exposure to what was going on here in the United States. The job at ABC, when I first came to ABC, I was part of an international division. ABC Sports worldwide sales and marketing. So I was specifically involved in distribution of ABC Sports content around the world. And then shortly after I joined, Capital Cities bought ABC. There were several different international divisions at ABC. They were all merged together. There was another international division called ABC Pictures International, which got merged together with ABC Sports worldwide sales. And so at that time, was selling the Academy Awards around the world, Moonlighting, which was a big series of Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd way back when. And at that time, it was when also the landscape internationally was starting to change, because up until probably the mid to the late 80s, this great revolution started to happen of privatization and commercialization of television around the world. And with that, there was a much bigger demand for content. And the production infrastructure around the world wasn't necessarily all geared for that volume of content. So many different platforms and countries around the world turned to the United States that was producing obviously a good deal of content. And we were off and running in terms of the growth of the international side of the business and providing programming to broadcasters all over the world.
And TV is a very dynamic business, and TV executive careers are often very dynamic as well. So in the 90s, that was your first stint at Viacom, then New World, then Universal. So I guess you were building a very in-depth knowledge of the industry, meeting lots of people, which is always very helpful later on when you get to a point where you are in a more senior position and you have contacts and really know the business inside out.
Yeah, our business is very much a relationship business. It always has been, and to a certain extent, it always will be. You mentioned those companies. Yeah, I've had a couple stints with Viacom. I left Viacom at the time that Viacom was in the process of acquiring Paramount. Actually, after the Paramount acquisition, that's when I went to join New World, and then ultimately New World was acquired by Fox, and left New World at that point and joined Universal. And all great experiences, all great companies, all great experiences, all dealing with great people around the world, both internally in each one of those companies and externally in terms of our client base around the world. And each step along the way, the industry continued to evolve and create new opportunities for the creation and monetization of content. But certainly the business also grew significantly along the way during the 90s.
And then we get to July 1999, and you joined CBS as president of CBS Broadcast International. The TV industry in the US in particular was very dynamic. What was happening at CBS was really interesting as well. What did the slate look like, and what was your focus when you joined CBS at that point?
Well, you've got to remember back then there was a question whether the U.S. marketplace could support 3 broadcast networks. And CBS was from kind of the mid 90s up to a point about 90 and 99 that was the third place network. And the reality is there's always, even to today, there's always been the talk of the death of the traditional broadcast networks, which I don't think will ever happen. I think there's always going to be demand for those traditional broadcast platforms. But I came in at a very interesting time. I came in, and a number of months after that I had come in, we were in the process of acquiring King World, which was the producer distributor shows like Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, and Oprah. And early on in 2000, we launched also Dr. Phil. So we were integrating King World's international distribution into CBS's. And not long after, there was an announcement that Viacom was acquiring CBS for the first time around. So I was part of CBS when we merged the first time. Then when we split the company, which was 2004, I want to say. And then obviously putting it back together again in 2 years ago. So I don't know how many executives could talk about being with a merging company, splitting a company, and merging it back together. Of the three things, splitting it is probably the hardest thing to do. I should also say at that time as well, that's when Survivor first launched. And also shortly thereafter, what was the year of CSI? CSI was probably 2000, 2001, I want to say. And so to have these two incredible franchises launch around the same time and grow into these huge global franchises, it was something incredible to see the seeds of that be planted and then see it bloom into what they both became. And especially CSI is a franchise which is going to be, in some way, shape, or form on different platforms all over the world, just forever.
But in a way, it was the one that got away. I mean, it came back to you guys, but it was Alliance Atlantis, and Desperate Networks talks about all this. And so, did you look at it and think, "Oh goodness me, if only we could have had that"? And then eventually you did.
I always wanted to have as much content as possible to monetize around the world. It wasn't really the one that got away. When you go back to that history of CSI, remember Disney was originally the first, our co-production partner on CSI. It was a very, again, back then it was another pilot, a very good pilot, but just another pilot with incredible production auspices with Jerry Bruckheimer. And when Disney decided to make the decision to pull out of it, it was a business question about, okay, so, how are we going to afford the production of this? And to Alliance Atlantis' credit, for them to come in, a Canadian company coming in and putting the money on the table to be a kind of help with the deficit financing and taking the risk to do that. That's what, now in hindsight, you say CSI, of course, but back then there's a significant risk in any network series. Now, that reward for them, the reward was significant. And Alliance Atlantis were great partners with us for many years through all of that. I often tease with my friends at Alliance Atlantis. It was like a little old lady going to Las Vegas for the very first time and betting on the roulette wheel and putting all the chips on one number and it coming out that number. But they did a great job of monetizing. They were great partners. And then when the assets of Alliance Atlantis were being sold and we had the opportunity to take it back, it was great to have the franchise back. And again, we sold it. It was a key franchise to sell over and over again all over the world. And so, I never looked at it as the one that got away. It's just a great part of the story.
Certainly, when I started, movies were really the big driver, the most highly demanded US content. But over time, the series and in particular a lot of CBS series really became the drivers, and that took CBS under your watch to effectively the biggest distributor by value of any of the studios, which was an incredible turnaround. What was the driver of that, do you think? What changed?
Well, thinking back to those days, again, the motivating factor for many broadcast platforms around the world to do output deals with studios were based primarily on the feature film content they were going to get from the studios. And so when the time of the split came with CBS and Paramount, I remember us thinking, okay, so we're not going to have these features now, and we were actually thinking about it as a negative. But to your point, just around that time, that focus kind of shifted. I mean, there was always a demand for studios' feature films, and that demand still exists today. But that shift took place. And again, it was, kind of started with these big franchise shows like CSI and NCIS, and a few others from other studios like Lost. And there were a number of great shows that were all 24 that were kind of all of that similar period that were very successful both in the United States and around the world. But the timing of all this was quite fortuitous to us. We had a number of different franchise shows that were all kind of coming out in those years. We also took over the responsibility at that time of the distribution of the Showtime content. So we were, starting off with shows like Dexter. That again, different kind of client base for that type of programming from a premium paid platform, mostly distributing it to premium play platforms or other premium play platforms around the world. But again, it gave us just the power of that additional volume of content to distribute. So, yeah, we had a tremendous run there in terms of that television content and the volume of television content that we had. By the way, I just also have is a testament. I have a great friend and colleague, David Staff, who is still to this day president of CBS Studios, and David Evans as well, who's president of Showtime. Actually, now the CEO. I'm not sure what his title is now, but he still does look after. He actually looks after Paramount Plus as in addition to Showtime.
And I guess that success and creative output at CBS and Showtime was also a great platform. Those were really successful periods for them, and that then gave you that pipeline that you could really monetize.
Absolutely. I mean, we continued with volume and output arrangements based on the success of our studios. We were very fortunate of both the success of the content that our studio was creating, but having CBS Network as a platform, which was always broad and expansive in its reach. There were other networks at the time that were going more niche, and we were doing the old-fashioned kind of broadcasting model, literally. So that continued to be attractive for broadcasters around the world in terms of the kind of broad general market popularity of the kind of programming we were producing. So yes.
And I guess the team that you had were fantastic and were capable, and therefore were also part of that story of generating those revenues. Was there a certain type of person that you looked for, certain skills and personality traits that made that person the right fit for the team?
Interesting question. Our team is an evolution, and in some ways evolution of people that were in the old Paramount or the old CBS. And the secret of success, I think, of international distribution, the team that you have in all of your offices around the world, they rule the roost in each one of those territories, right? They are experts of whether you're sitting in Stephen Teague sitting in the London office, or Catherine Molyneux sitting in the Paris office, or Giovanni Pelli in Rome. They know those markets so incredibly well. Their relationships are second to none. So those individuals have that expertise in each one of those markets, and then you bring them together. And by the way, each one of our group, I don't want to go through and name each person in our group. But we had extraordinary leadership around the world that worked incredibly well and incredibly successful as individuals, but also as a team together in terms of coming together. And whether it was looking at a project or talking a project from inception on a script basis and giving the thoughts and insight on the potential monetization of those ideas. And when you have a show like Hawaii Five-0, it didn't take much on a script to say, yeah, this is going to be incredibly popular around the world. Or some other show that, it's, not everything that the studio network was going to do was going to be just based on global popularity. It might be specifically to cater to it might be a legal show in the US, or it may be a show that has content that is not necessarily going to be incredibly popular around the world. And we would go, into that knowing that. But we had a great team with a great skill set that was just very communicative. When you run a global operation, we were using video conferencing well before COVID around the world to communicate with each other. We'd get together as a group as often as possible, and we worked as a great team together. And I was very, very fortunate to have just an outstanding team. Again, both colleagues like Barry Chamberlain, who I work closely with. By the way, not only at CBS, but we worked together at New World, Universal, and CBS. And then when you're around the business as long as I had been, Stephen Tagg and I worked together in the first permutation of Viacom in the early 90s. So, at the end of the day, the pool of talent doing this sort of thing is also relatively small. So, at some point or other, you kind of come across everybody. But we were, again, very fortunate. I was very fortunate to lead just a fantastic team.
So Mip TV is around the corner. And it's a market very well. In fact, I think at one point you were given the Medal of Honor, Médaille d'Honneur of Mip TV, which seems to me the sort of thing that they would hand out during World War I for people to have a special medal for helping France. But
it's right there. It's right behind me over
there. So clearly you're very vested in that market. Is it great to see markets like Mip and Mipcom coming back?
Without question. Look, the last couple of years for all of us has been very difficult, very challenging. I think technology has helped us overcome to a certain aspects of the challenge of seeing each other, communicating with each other. But I don't think that technology replaces that ability to see each other in person and interact with each other in person. From everything I hear, I think it's going to be a rather robust MIP. Different format of MIP, but still, I think it's going to be pretty well attended, which will lead into the LA screenings and lead into MIPCOM. So I think that there is a pent-up demand of seeing each other in person. NAPI, which I sit on the board of and on the executive committee of, it was unfortunate what happened with Omicron because NAPI was really pretty well teed up to have a pretty good market in January, but with just the uncertainty of the Omicron when that kicked in, and the timing couldn't have been worse for NATB. But I think that again, technology is great, and what we're doing right now is terrific via Zoom. But it just still doesn't replace that need to see each other and be with each other. And I think MIP is in for. I wish to a certain extent I was going, but I will be back at some point.
Do you miss it? Do you miss the buzz and the pitching and all the elements?
I miss certain aspects of it. What people always were trying to figure out was what we were doing at markets, when we were in those meetings behind closed doors, and what was the business that was going on, and especially in a market like MIP from a U.S. perspective, that you didn't have really anything new to go out there and sell. You were waiting for that 1 month later, and really everything was going to be rolled out at the LA screenings. And I don't think that was ever really understanding that it's just the business of our business. Any opportunity to have you sit down with your major clients, there was always things to talk about, whether there were both issues and problems that need to be resolved or opportunities. There was always a need to sit down and just have a dialogue with each other, particularly our bigger clients. But even when it gets to the smaller clients, again, going to a market gives you that opportunity in some cases of clients that we wouldn't otherwise see from smaller territories, or our sales executives wouldn't have the opportunity to travel to. And look, obviously markets there's going to be an evolution of the markets and the themes of markets going forward, especially as the industry has evolved. But I think again, I really do think there is a pent up demand for people to see each other and be with each other. And I think my first MIP was 1983. And back then, by the way, it was the basement of the Palais that we were all in. It was, if I recall, it was either a 6 or 7 day market. And they allowed smoking back then as well. So you'd be in the basement, breathing god-awful air. I remember usually you're more likely not to come back not feeling all that great after that week in the basement of the Palais. But I wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world. It was a great experience.
Is there anything in the long, lustrous career that you've had that you'd pick as a highlight, or a couple of things that really stand out where you think to yourself, yeah, that was pretty cool to be involved in?
There's a number of things that I'm very proud of, and again, proud of company and the colleagues I work with together. It was very cool to launch this to Star Trek Discovery, and that deal that we did with Netflix at the time to launch it. And again, remember that was a cornerstone of what was our new direct-to-consumer platform, CBS All Access. So to have the kind of the responsibility of bringing back an iconic show and franchise like Star Trek, and to be able to do what we did was I think just a great memory for me. The acquisition of Network 10 in Australia. Also, I look back on that, and there were so many people, both in my group and corporately, that I worked with together to think that we were able to actually pull that deal off. Being involved in the CSIs and in the NCISs were just amazing things. Being involved in the split of the companies. There's some fond memories of that, not so fond memories of that, because it's just not an easy thing to do to separate companies that are merged together. Witnessing the evolution of the business, and then that next evolution with what Netflix originally did in terms of their expansion internationally, and then Amazon, and then a number of other platforms around the world. It's just it's all been amazing to watch.
And is there something that you would point to as a lesson or learnings that you would pass on to the next generation, to use a Star Trek analogy, but the next generation coming through as a way of becoming or being successful in this business?
Yeah, look, never think you know it all. Be a sponge, just soak it all in. I think, you have to have a passion for whatever you do as well. And I was very fortunate. I had a great passion for this business. I mean, as a kid growing up, I loved television content. And again, I was fortunate enough to get exposed to, international television content at a very young age. Life is not static. Everything continues to change and evolve, and you have to go along with that evolution and change. You can't just be resistant and stubborn to change.
So this is the part of the podcast where I ask my guests for their lockdown film, book, music choice, and TV box set, inspired by the lockdowns and pandemics that we've had to deal with. So hopefully this is a relic of the past, but it unfortunately still retains some resonance. So what would be these media that would get you through a future lockdown?
When the lockdown started, I have a now 21-year-old son. At the time, I guess he was 19 or 20. We went back and we watched the whole Marvel universe together, because I had seen some of the movies, not all the movies. He had seen all of them, but not necessarily in the order that they were released in. So watching it together helped, because he could explain to me because there were some of the movies I had no idea what was going on, and he was able to explain to me. So we watched all the Marvel movies together. In exchange, I asked him to be patient and to sit through the Godfather trilogy together. I think he had more success having me watch Marvel than I had with him getting to watch get through The Godfather. But he will appreciate the Godfather movies. It's just he needs I think a few more years of maturity. I subscribe to Sirius XM here, and there's the 1980s channel that I continuously listen to, and my son pokes a lot of fun at. But my dear friend Sarah Wright from Sky, who is also a 1980s music buff, would appreciate that very retro cool decade of music.
And finally, TV box set. I guess it might be Star Trek.
Well, I wouldn't put Star Trek in that category because that's just something kind of continuously every once in a while. When you flip it through the channels, if it's up someplace, I'll just tune into it. Did go back and watch a few earlier versions of early seasons of 24, which reminded me how good that series was. And again, at that time, what a novel concept it was, and it's held up reasonably well to I guess that's 20 years later, right? I did go back, and it seems self-serving, but I'm not selling it anymore. But I did go back and watch the earlier seasons of Billions and Ray Donovan, and again was reminded how good those shows are. And now, more recently, I've gone back to see go back to the early seasons of Succession, which is brilliant as well.
Well, Armando Nunez, thank you so much for being a guest on the pod and sharing memories and thoughts of the past. And when it comes to the future, I can only say from a fellow Trekkie, live long and prosper.
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to do that. Danny, thanks for asking me to do this. It was a real pleasure. Very much appreciated.